Conflict is a feature of the earthly ministry of Jesus. All four of our Gospels described the ministry of Jesus as a time of intense and mounting conflict, culminating in his death upon the cross. The American author Helen Kelly Hunt once wrote, "Conflict is growth trying to happen." Conflict can be described as a failure to be in agreement with or to be in accord with. In our text, we will see two conflict situations taking place where Jesus is at the very center. Our Lord would be in conflict with the crowd and also in conflict with the 12 disciples. And yet out of these two conflict situations, the disciples would grow as observed by Helen Kelly Hunt. And they would grow specifically in their understanding of the person and work of Jesus Christ. You will remember that when the disciples returned from a mission trip that Jesus sent them on, as recorded in Mark chapter 6, verses 7 to 13, that they returned from that Pacific mission trip very excited and with a very good report. They had seen God work in and in through them. And as Mark chapter 6 verse 13 tells us, that many people benefited from their ministry. And so when they gathered to meet with Jesus, they came along with very good reports, but also with a bloated ego and an elevated sense of self-importance. They also returned with a small crowd who also benefited from their ministry. And so they were eager to tell Jesus everything what they had taught and everything what they had done. But they were going to do it in such a way that they would broadcast their ministry feats, and with the crowd that acts as their fan base, they would be endorsed and ultimately validated by the response of the crowd. Jesus knew that they were in danger of falling into what is called the paradox of ministry, in that they would fail in the midst of their success. And so instead of rebuking them for their inflated ego, instead of rebuking them for the misplacement of their trust, and that is in themselves, Jesus invites them. He invites them to a wilderness place. And those who were reading this text for the first time, and that was the church that was suffering persecution in Rome, would recognize that that phrase, a wilderness place, would mean something very unique to them and unique to the disciples. That the wilderness place played a very important role in the history of Israel. Moses led the people out of captivity into the wilderness place, where they experienced God in a very special way. And so when Jesus invited them to a wilderness place, those who were reading this text would know that the wilderness text was a place where God taught Israel through Moses. It will also be a place where Jesus would teach the disciples. They would also remember that the wilderness place was a place where the people of Israel were tested by God. And in the wilderness, Jesus would test the 12 disciples. They will also know that in the wilderness place, that the wilderness was a place where they saw God miraculously providing for the people of Israel in the form of manna and meat. In the wilderness, the disciples would see how Jesus provides for them and for the 12 and for the crowd that followed them. And ultimately, the people reading this would see the wilderness place as a time where they would discover God or Yahweh as the shepherd who gives rest for his people Israel. And the disciples would discover the same thing, that Jesus would be to them a true shepherd who gives rest to his sheep. And so in the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus achieved all four of these goals. So let's look at the first conflict, the conflict between Jesus and the crowd. We will remember that Jesus and his 12 men got on a boat to go to some kind of ministry retreat. The crowd that followed them back was expected to disperse and to go back to their places of homes or their places where they came from. But instead, the crowd did not do that. And so when Jesus got onto the boat with his 12 men, the crowd followed them along the shore. And so as the boat was sailing, the crowd was able to gather even more people. And having some kind of snowballing effect, they started to grow exponentially. And when Jesus and his disciples arrived at their place of destination where they were going to have their small retreat, the crowd was there waiting for them. And the crowd was a bit of an unexpected guest to their party or to their retreat. And the plans that Jesus had to spend some quality time with his disciples and to deprogram them and to allow them to rest was disrupted by the presence of this large crowd. In essence, the crowd was in conflict with the goals that Jesus had for his 12 men. And so the question that we need to ask, and the question that must be asked, is how did Jesus respond to this disruption to his plans? It was clear that the crowd was expecting Jesus to teach them. Jesus wanted to spend some quality time with his 12 men. So instead, when they came to their place of destination, they were met by an unexpected and an uninvited crowd. And so Jesus would be in good company if he dismissed the crowd, because they were disrupting his plan. And so we read in Mark chapter 6 verse 34 that when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so he began teaching them many things. So instead of being irritated by the presence of the crowd, Jesus responded to this conflict in a very unique way. Mark tells us that Jesus saw the large crowd. And one could imagine that the crowd was large, it was unorganized, they were in some form of chaos. And so Jesus was not angry at them, but rather he was moved with compassion. And so in responding to this disruption, we see Jesus revealing something about himself to his disciples, that he is not an irritated shepherd, but rather he is a compassionate shepherd, that he had compassion. Now what Mark does there is that he describes Jesus in very unique terms. Here he describes Jesus as someone who was moved with compassion. The original term simply means that he was moved in his innermost being when he looked on the desperation and on the spiritual condition of the crowd. And so what Mark tells us, that he was not an irritated shepherd, but rather he was a compassionate shepherd. That the conflict between Jesus and the crowd was resolved because of his compassion. Instead of being angry with the crowd, for preventing him from spending time with his disciples, he had compassion on them. And so Mark says to us that he was moved with compassion. In other words, instead of moving the crowd away, he was moved with compassion. And then Mark uses a very unique phrase in describing the crowd. He says, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. And Jesus resolved this shepherdlessness of the crowd by teaching them many things. And the phrase that is used there is very interesting. A sheep without a shepherd is a phrase that makes its appearance for the first time in Numbers chapter 27, verses 15 to 17. The context there is that Moses is coming to the end of his ministry and to the end of his life. God told Moses that he will not be allowed to enter into the promised land. And so Moses realized that there would be a vacuum in the leadership of Israel. And as a good shepherd, he prays for God to provide for an alternative to his ministry and to his shepherding. And so we read in Mark chapter 27, verses 15 to 17, Moses prayed. These were his words. Let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in, so that the congregation of the Lord, and here's the phrase, may not be as sheep not having a shepherd. And so what Mark is telling us is that not only is Jesus the compassionate shepherd who has compassion on people who are in a state of lostness, he's also the answer to the prayer of Moses in Numbers chapter 27, verses 15 to 17. That prayer of Moses, that God would raise up a man who would shepherd the people of God, was answered immediately in the presence of Joshua. Joshua took over from Moses to lead the people into the promised land. But that prayer that Moses prayed back then was ultimately answered and looking to the coming of the true shepherd. That Jesus is indeed the answer to the prayer that Moses prayed. That God would raise up a person, a shepherd, so that the congregation of the Lord may not be as sheep not having a shepherd. And so instead of being angry with the crowd, instead of being irate with the crowd, Jesus is compassionate on them. And then he gives the reason for that compassion, that they were like sheep not having a shepherd. In other words, that Mark is telling us that the prayer that Moses prayed that many centuries ago was ultimately answered in the coming of Christ. That he was indeed the shepherd who would go out before his people, who would come in before them, who will lead them out and bring them in. That indeed he is the one who will see that those who are his sheep will not be like sheep not having a shepherd. And in the Gospel of John, we are told that Jesus is indeed the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. And so what we see and what the disciples had to learn, and it's an additional layer to the person of Christ, is that he is indeed the compassionate shepherd. He is indeed the shepherd that Moses prayed for in Numbers chapter 27, verses 15 to 17. In addition to that, by using that phrase, Mark is telling us that Jesus is also the shepherd that Ezekiel prophesied about in Ezekiel chapter 34. In the context there, is that Yahweh, through Ezekiel, is condemning the faithless shepherds of Israel, who failed to lead the people because they have fed themselves and have used the sheep as a means to greedily satisfy their needs. The shepherds of Israel, the leaders of Israel, neglected the congregation of God. They neglected the people of Israel and allowed them to be scattered and exposed them to ravenous wolves, and people would take advantage of them. But in the same chapter, in Ezekiel chapter 34, Yahweh promised that He would appoint a faithful shepherd, someone in the mold of His servant David, who would care for His flock, someone who would establish a covenant of peace with the people of Israel, so that the people of Israel will dwell in safety in the midst of the wilderness and in the midst of the forest. The attitude of the shepherds in Jesus' time and the attitude of the shepherds in Ezekiel's day was the same. The people was being neglected, and therefore they were sheep not having a shepherd. And so what Mark is telling us is that Jesus is the promised shepherd, and to use a theological term, He is the eschatological shepherd that is coming in the mold of David, who would shepherd the people. In other words, that He would be the shepherd king. And so by using that phrase, that they were like sheep not having a shepherd, Mark is telling us that Jesus is the prophetic shepherd, as it were, that Ezekiel prophesied about. And so the lesson that Jesus wanted to teach His disciples by taking them into the wilderness is that He is the compassionate shepherd that Moses prayed about in the book of Numbers. That He is also the shepherd that was promised by God in Ezekiel chapter 34, who would make sure that the sheep would not be as sheep not having a shepherd. And so God was adding another layer to the person of Christ, so that the disciples would grow in their confidence by placing their confidence in Jesus, who is the answer to the prayer of Moses, as recorded in Numbers chapter 27. He is also the prophetic shepherd that Ezekiel promised and prophesied about. And so the question that we need to ask is, so what? How does the fact that Jesus is the shepherd who is the ultimate answer to Moses' prayer, as recorded in Numbers chapter 27, verses 15 to 17, how does that fact impact us? Or how does the fact that He is the shepherd that Ezekiel promised and prophesied about in Ezekiel chapter 37, in Ezekiel chapter 34, how does that fact affect us? Our spiritual wilderness can be a time of intense and concentrated pain and hardship, where we feel isolated and abandoned, and we are indeed in desperate need for a shepherd. It's a time when we can identify with the phrase that we feel like sheep not having a shepherd. It is at this time that we will discover, as the disciples did, that in the midst of our wilderness experiences, that Jesus is the true shepherd who will sustain us and will give us rest when we need it the most.